A mutiny in Eritrea, almost completely unnoticed. The small country in the Horn of Africa remains isolated and repressed, with thousands of political prisoners, a constitution that remains in limbo, and a president who's failed to keep promises of reform. Analysts say more challenges are inevitable. Hello there, welcome to Inside Story. I'm Shiulie Ghosh. It's a secretive African nation that's been ruled by one party and one president since it gained independence in 1993. Now, the tiny nation of Eritrea is in the headlines for an army mutiny that may or may not have been a coup attempt. On Monday, a group of soldiers took over the state-run television service in an apparent rebellion which failed. But analysts say it's only a matter of time before Eritrea's President Isaias Afawerki is confronted again. Khadija Magadi reports.
In the port city of Asmara, life goes on for its nearly 700,000 residents, largely unaware of a mutiny by renegade soldiers. Eritrea is effectively a one-party state, with nearly all state power vested in one man, President Isaias Afawerki. Afawerki and his People's Front for Democracy and Justice have ruled Eritrea since 1993. The man who the US once praised as a Renaissance leader has promised elections and to open up the political system, neither of which materialized. The country's reportedly poor human rights record and restrictive press laws have drawn comparisons with North Korea. It's an image the president disputes.
Human Rights Watch says you are turning this country into a giant prison and creating a human rights crisis.
You can walk around and see for yourself if that is true. Again, it's a lie. The people here don't.
You promised democracy?
No one here promises anybody anything.
You can't even.
There is nothing, there is no commodity called democracy.
By some estimates, nearly half of Eritrea's population lives below the poverty line. Part of the problem is that most of the country's working population is in uniform. Eritrea has more soldiers per person than any other country except North Korea, with recruits expected to work for the state after they serve. The state keeps its young men in the army to fend off what it calls aggression from Ethiopia. The two neighbors have had a tense relationship since they fought a bloody 2-year border war in which nearly 700,000 people died. And the UN accuses Eritrea of arming and supporting Al-Shabaab rebels in Somalia, something it denies. But it's problems closer to home that have a growing youthful population dissatisfied. With shrinking opportunities and little choice but the army, many are forced to leave. The attempt at forcing reform appears to have been put down for now, but with discontent growing among not just the military but the powerful Eritrean diaspora, it may be a sign of things to come. Khadija Magadi for Inside Story.
So a lot of issues to discuss there. Let's introduce my guests in our London studios. Abdurrahman Elsayyid from the Eritrean National Democratic Forces, a pro-democracy network committed to the advocacy and promotion of human rights. From Oxford in the UK, Jason Mosley, Associate Fellow for the Africa Programme at Chatham House. And in Washington, D.C., Kwaku Nuamah, an assistant professor at the American University School of International Service. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. I should start off by saying that it's actually proved quite difficult to get information out of Asmara. We tried to contact government sources. None of them would speak to us. So, Abdurrahman, if I can start with you. I wonder what you make of this mutiny, this attempted coup, whatever you want to call it. It's being described by one journalist in Asmara, who we did manage to speak to, as a tempest in an Asmara teacup.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think it is a serious incident that reflects the growing dissent within the Eritrean government, the army, and the population at large. The whole incident yesterday happened within the Ministry of Information, and they tried to control that ministry and broadcast their demands. One thing I should say, it is not necessarily a coup d'etat, because the demand was mainly around the implementation of the constitution of the country, that was ratified by a rubber stamp parliament pro the regime itself in 1997. And ever since then, this constitution has never been implemented. The second issue is the growing problem of related to the economy, to human rights, and the no war, no peace situation between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which makes every single Eritrean over the age of 18 literally an army soldier that have to report to the army camps and work there either in construction in favor of the regime's companies or stay in the trenches guarding the country's borders.
This is the National Conscription Service that you're talking about, that every young Eritrean is expected to sign up for the army, and then well, it seems to me to be that they have to stay with the army for some unspecified indefinite period.
The official introduction of this conscription was for a specific period that would not exceed 2 years, including a period of time on training. However, the situation has been once you are in the army, you stay there indefinitely. There's no way out. And for this reason, people are fleeing the country on foot, crossing the border to Sudan and Eritrea at the rate of 3,000 young Eritreans, trained Eritreans from the army every month. Now, this is happening at a great risk to their lives because the government has a shoot-to-kill policy that anyone caught crossing the border would be shot dead. But people are facing this risk in order to flee the country because staying in the army, it's not simply carrying a gun and guarding the borders, but it also means you have to build villas for some privileged generals of the army, for some companies that the regime runs as a kind of a business conglomerates. They have to work there free of any salaries. We call it enslavement, and this is well documented and well reported in several reports, including the Human Rights Watch in America, Amnesty International, and several other agencies have documented this very well, and it's a public knowledge.
Okay, yeah, just on that point, let's bring in Kwaku, because as Abdurrahman is saying, the military is, I think I'm right in saying it's one of the biggest standing armies in the world, given the size of the population. And the problem is that young Eritreans are forced to serve in this army. And that is such a big problem that many Eritreans are actually trying to leave Eritrea.
Yes, and this is the problem of the country. Eritrea's inability to transition to a normal state after the war with Ethiopia is at the root of this problem. There's a lot of frustration among young people in Asmara and other parts of the country who see no opportunity for social mobility in a country that is increasingly becoming paranoid and has engaged many of its neighbors in conflicts, and there's dissent is growing. It's suppressed by the regime, but that's not a sustainable option. And as we've seen with this attempted coup, demand-bearing groups are emerging in the country, and they will keep pushing. And I think at some point the regime is going to have to realize that it cannot keep the lid on its troubles or blame outsiders forever. It's going to have to come to the table and negotiate with these people who want change, particularly the youth.
So that is one issue. The other issue, which has already been touched on, is the lack of political reform that's been going on in Eritrea. Kwaku, I mean, the president came to power promising that there would be political reforms, that there would be democracy. There was even a constitution, as Abdurrahman points out, that was ratified but never implemented. What's gone wrong?
Well, it came to power through a revolutionary war. It was always Marxist-Lenin, so democracy was not part of his agenda. But once it took power in Asmara, the promises that were made were deferred because it immediately had to deal with Ethiopia, and that conflict became an excuse for not transitioning. As a matter of fact, in 2001, senior members of the party approached Afawerki and made modest demands for some form of political liberalization, and they were arrested, and many were held in jail for a long time. So this is not a regime that is willing to liberalize or to introduce any form of democratic measures, and it's not even outside of the realm of politics. The social and economic suppression, religious institutions. There's only 4 recognized religious bodies in the country, and everybody else, it's routinely harassed by the government. NGOs are harassed. Eritreans who live overseas have to pay a tax, or their family members are harassed in the country. And this is not sustainable. It's amazing that the regime has managed to stay intact up to this point. And part of that has been the excuse of foreign wars. We are fighting wars with Ethiopia and with Djibouti, and of course its increasing involvement in the Somali conflict. So this gives it some type of leeway as it's able to externalize some of its problems. But the economy is in bad shape. Now we see that the military,
just before we go on from here, sorry, Kwaku, I just want to give some background on Eritrea to our audiences. So Eritrea, as we've said, gained independence in 1993. That was after a 30-year war with Ethiopia. It then plunged straight back into conflict with its neighbour over border issues. Eritrea is a small nation in the Horn of Africa along the Red Sea coast. Now, it has a population of around 6 million people. The UN estimates that Eritrea is holding up to 10,000 political prisoners. Human rights groups accuse the government of torture and summary executions. And Transparency International ranks it as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Jason Mosley, if Eritrea is described as the North Korea of Africa, then Afawerki surely is Kim Jong-un. He is the president, the head of the single political party and the head of the military, and has been for 20 years.
Well, he has been in charge of the military for the 20 years since independence. He was also the leader of the Liberation Front for since the mid-70s. So he's been in place for about 40 years. I really don't find comparisons with North Korea to be constructive in any meaningful way for understanding the Eritrean context, just because the parallels, superficial parallels, don't stack up after you start digging a little bit. And I think it's also quite important to keep in mind the regional context that Eritrea emerged into as an independent nation.
Okay, well, so what is your response to some of the points that the other guests have made about the lack of religious freedom, the lack of political freedom, the fact that there are some 10,000 political prisoners, and that there is no sign of any democratic reform which has been promised in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that prompted me to come in today and participate in your program was that after about a decade, I think Kwaku just mentioned the fellows who were rounded up for challenging Isaias after the 1998 to 2000 war with Ethiopia, and sort of reminding him about the Constitution and chivying him towards loosening his control. Since then, there has been no open challenge to the authority inside Eritrea. All of the political opposition is based outside the country, and as has been noted, there isn't much space for NGOs or religious organizations or civil society organizations to debate the system of government or the direction of the country within Eritrea. So the fact that you had whatever was the motivation of these troops, they did take over the television broadcaster for a little bit and managed to broadcast a message about the Constitution and release of political prisoners. They didn't say anything about Isaias leaving. And as you noted in the introduction, it's very difficult to get any information out of Eritrea from the outside. So I think that's really important for considering and making the starting point for a meaningful discussion about what's going on in Eritrea. But in terms of the regional picture, some of the things that are associated with the Eritrean government in terms of its influence in the conflicts in the region are not unique to the Eritrean government. The Ethiopian government, the Sudanese government, to a great or lesser extent, are active in each other's internal politics as well. And that's been a pattern that's been going on for decades.
But it is the fact that it is the
that.
case that the UN has put sanctions on Eritrea for supporting armed groups in Somalia, isn't it?
Yes, and also related to the border skirmish with Djibouti in 2008.
Abdurrahman, is there a lot of concern outside Eritrea for what's going on inside Eritrea? I know that the US, for example, is very worried by the lack of freedom of expression inside Eritrea, and the UN, as we've said, has put sanctions on Eritrea. Is there growing international concern about this closed regime?
Absolutely, because Eritrea is on a very sensitive region. The Red Sea is a lifeline for international trade. Anything that happens within the southern shores of the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, which is equally important as the Suez Canal in the north, the oil export from the Gulf region goes through this shipping line. There is a huge importance not just to the region, but also to the international economy and the international security and politics. But also to come back to the issue of whether Eritrea can be compared to North Korea. Of course it can be compared because it's a secretive nation. The fact that we cannot get any information from Eritrea, it's another example that there is a similarity between these two countries. The absence of free press in the country, the absence of any kind of rule of law. I mean, people talk about 10,000 detainees. These are political detainees. Who have never had any chance to come forward to the court of law to either prove them, guilt or innocent. And they include ministers and senior army generals and civil servants. And therefore, the situation in the country is very volatile, very fragile. The other concern for the international community is the collapse of a state. Totalitarian regimes now normally, when they fall apart, they implicate on the country's law and order. When you have a total failure like Somalia, then the issue even gets worse because you will have issues of terrorism, piracy, and all sorts of other problems that can have spillover effects to the immediate spillover effect to the regional countries, but as well as to international shipping line and trade.
Let's just have a look at the human rights issue inside Eritrea. So great is the UN concern over reports of detentions, torture, summary executions. Last year it appointed a special rapporteur for Eritrea. Bidwanti Kitharuth has urged the Eritrean government to cooperate over the human rights situation. She says, "I hope that the Eritrean government would consider the mandate of the special rapporteur as an opportunity to start a fresh and constructive dialogue on human rights issues that have been raised by the international community and other stakeholders." Unfortunately, as yet, she hasn't been welcomed into Eritrea. Kwaku, it's interesting that even other African countries backed the appointment of a special rapporteur for Eritrea, and that's unusual because African leaders are notorious for trying to shield each other.
Exactly. And the denial of basic human rights in Eritrea is just appalling. The way prisoners are treated. Prisoners don't have any right to recourse within the system. There are reports that prisoners are held in shipping containers in underground cells, and they are denied visitation by family members. It's just appalling, even by African standards.
Can I just ask you, Kwaku, do we know that for sure, do we? Because Jason makes the very good point that it's actually quite difficult to get information out of Asmara and that you have to put these things into context. So do we know that this has been verified, has it?
Well, we don't know, and the regime denies it. But I've been to Eritrea, and I've seen how the society functions. In public spaces, in restaurants, there are spies everywhere. If you talk to waitresses and waiting staff, and in hotels, they tell you we're not allowed to fraternize with foreigners. There are government spies here. There are government minders everywhere. There are soldiers with guns in in post offices. All kinds of stuff happening in Eritrea that shouldn't happen in normal societies. And it's part of the secrecy of the regime makes it hard to verify these things, and they won't let international observers in the country. So it's hard for us to know exactly what's happening there, and people disappear in Eritrea all the time. And I think the biggest evidence of how bad things are is the fact that the Eritreans are willing to risk their lives trying to leave the state. The people are voting with their feet.
Yeah,
and it's the biggest indictment against a government.
Let me put that to Jason. I take the point that no one can ever know exactly what's going on in there, but as both our guests say, there's documented evidence that thousands and thousands of Eritreans are risking their lives trying to get out of the country. So clearly there's something that they're getting away from.
Yeah, and I don't want to see this discussion degenerate into a sort of attack or defend the Eritrean government or economy. There's certainly a very serious situation that is causing all of these thousands of young people to try and escape. We haven't even mentioned the conditions that they will endure once they've gotten out of, if they manage to get out of Eritrea on the way to economic opportunities in Europe, the things that happen to migrants in the desert of Sinai, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the information I was mentioning was more in terms of trying to understand what happened yesterday. Things that have been happening over the course of the last 2 decades. There's been the opportunity to amass some information. The idea that some prisoners are held in shipping containers, I think, it doesn't necessarily need to be strongly contested either way.
Okay.
The thing that is worth exploring, I think, is that this government has lasted 20 years in these conditions, and I think that's worth trying to understand, and trying to understand also what the question of Ethiopia and Eritrea's relationship means for understanding where we go now. As you mentioned in your introduction, there's been some comment by analysts that this won't be the last time, and as I was sort of alluding in my first comment, the fact that this happened at all after more than a decade of sort of no word from the domestic opposition or from domestic voices of dissent suggests that there may indeed be some movement.
Let me put that to Abdurrahman. Do you agree with that point, that there may well be movement on this, that we may see more challenges, more confrontations to the president, although it has to be said that the soldiers involved in this latest incident didn't call for him to be removed from power?
There is definitely, it's not maybe, but there's a definitely dissent and some kind of movement going on within the country, within the party, within the army. Now, the fact that the regime stayed in power for the last 20 years, there are a number of factors that explains this issue. The first one is, the first thing the regime did was to conscript every single young person into the army. The second thing they did was to close the only one existing university in the country. So there is no student movement of any kind, especially after some movement that was, that happened immediately after the war, and then it was crushed. The third area is any high school student, once they get to the last year of the high school, before sitting for the school leaving examination, which is like equivalent to the GCSE here in the UK, they will have to go to an army camp in a military zone where they will have to sit for that examination. Once they are there, they do not have the freedom to live as they wish. The government or the agents of the government decide who they would want to stay and who.
Sorry, we're coming to the end of the discussion. I just want to ask very quickly, where do you think the next challenge is going to come from? From within Afawerki's own circle?
Unfortunately, it has to come from within Afawerki's, because the main opposition are in the diaspora. They're not allowed any kind of freedom of movement inside the country. So any change has to come from within the army, within the party, within the civil service.
Gentlemen, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you very much indeed for all your contributions. I want to thank my guests, Abdurrahman Elsayyid, Jason Mosley and Kwaku Nuamah. Now, don't forget, you can contact us at any time. You can tweet the programme at AJ Inside Story or email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But from all the team here, bye for now.